Alrighty, what's up, Patreons? So today is lesson 4 of the top 10 things I've learned in 500 episodes. And today might be one of the most important and definitely one of the biggest changes for me in the last few years. And it's glassing, like glass, glass, glass. I've learned a ton over the years, both from experience and from a lot of the people that I've had on the podcast, interviewees, and definitely changed my style of hunting and really how I look at everything. So I want to talk about this quite a bit. Whether you think you're, never going to glass, you're not patient, we're going to dive into that. But for me, I grew up hunting Roosevelts and blacktails. Like glassing was not really a top priority. In fact, my dad probably never had a pair of binos. He used a 3x9 Leupold, and that was about it. So, that's kind of the mentality I grew up in. So it was a pretty hard shift for me to want to glass and spend time glassing. And I think one of the biggest things for me was disassociating myself from this identity of not being patient. I was ambitious, right? I was always like, go, go, go. And I thought that was my strong suit. I thought getting over the next hill or just going faster and harder than everyone else was my unique advantage. And I learned that, patience is something that I had to learn. And it's definitely I would say my unique advantage when it comes to hunting. So those are the kind of things we're going to talk about and dive into. So if you think you're like, hey, I'm too gung-ho, like I think you should look at patience is a habit to be learned and not a trait. So a lot of us think of patience as like, oh, hey, it's something I don't have. And I want you to think about it more as a habit to develop and work on, and not just a trait that you have or don't have. It can be learned and it can be mastered. So one of the biggest things as we dive into kind of learning how to be a great glasser or how to glass better maybe is it boils down to choosing glassing locations. And I think this is a huge thing that I've learned from a lot of guests is we tend to look at maps, we tend to look at everything and say, okay, hey, I'm going to get to this awesome glassing location. I'll be able to see everything. And I always use the analogy, it's kind of like marketing. When you market to everyone, you market to no one. And so from the best glassing point on the mountain, right? Everyone else sees that. And one of the biggest things I learned is to choose different glassing locations. Maybe not the best. Maybe it's not, the highest peak that I can see everything from, because inevitably, if other people or a lot of people are glassing from that location, you're going to see the same things they are. And, as we try to look for older age class or maybe animals that just haven't been messed with, you're going to start seeing different groups of animals. You're going to see different age groups of animals if you try to choose different locations. So one of the best things I've learned is like choosing my location, whether that's e-scouting or just hiking around in the woods and what I can see. And there are definitely a time and a place to be able to see the entire mountain. But by and large, as I've honed my skill of glassing, I've focused in on tighter areas and smaller areas. So this concept of being able to see everything versus being able to see something that no one else is seeing. And, I've talked with this with the roundies and talking about how they can see the whole mountain. They want to be able to see as much as going on, but then hyper focus into what you're looking at. Specifically on mule deer, it's like you want to be able to view the entire mountain. And that's where big glass helps. Like whether it's big eyes or just running your spotter, getting farther back than everyone can actually be a big piece of it, right? So it's combining the two. So instead of looking at the world and saying like, okay, hey, here's a glassing point, and I can see 360 degrees for a mile in every direction. Well, maybe we should get back and say, I want to look at 3 miles away or 2 miles away and look at the big picture. And once I get an idea of where groups of animals are or features that I'm looking for, then I can zoom in and kind of get to that point where now I'm glassing at 500 to 1,000, but I'm looking in specific areas very well. And so this is this concept of instead of just looking at like, okay, hey, we're going to find the best glassing point, I want you to look at it and say, okay, we're going to look as broad as we can and then specific. And so that's the kind of thinking outside of the box and doing it in a different way than everyone else. The other thing that you probably heard people say before is like switching up angles. And I read this a lot and I heard this from a lot of guests, but I was really terrible at implementing it. I think when you really look at what the greats do, they have this ability to say, okay, I looked at the big mountain, now I'm moving into this particular basin, but I'm going to switch my angles. And it's amazing. I always say it's the rule of 50%. Assume you can only see 50% of what you're looking at from your position. And you can look at a basin and think, man, I can see everything. This is the perfect glassing location. But assume you can only see 50%. And how do you see a different 50%? And, a lot of these canyons or basins have a lot of folds. They have a lot of micro terrain. It's amazing, sheer amazing what you can't see. And so some of it is just like, okay, how do we move 100 yards? It doesn't have to be a ton, and get better about moving 100 yards and spending more hours looking at the same basin, but from different locations. A lot of us, and for me in particular, when I started getting at least decent at glassing, I started trying to say, okay, the best in the world spend their time glassing. I'm going to do the same. But I would A, get bored, or B, like, okay, I've glassed this basin, there's nothing in it, I need to move to the next one. One of the ways you can help, refine that habit of being patient and not the trait is to say, okay, I'm going to move 200 yards. Maybe I'm just going to go to a different point. And that sounds like a lot of work at the time, but like just go to a little bit different point. Come around a quarter of the basin, and I'm going to glass there for another 2 hours or 3 hours. And then I'm going to go this way, or I'm going to keep moving. And maybe I'm just going to plan it out. So I have, every 200 yards, I'm looking at a different side of this basin. And I'm going to spend a couple hours doing glassing from each of those locations. I'm going to get comfortable, and I'm going to use my glass, and that's what it's for. And so just utilizing different angles is huge, huge, huge. I think it's something we all kind of know, but we don't really do very well. The next thing that I want to bring to is something that Greg Krough taught me, and I still use to this day. When let's hypothetically say you're out looking and you see a group of does, you see 3 or 4 does, and you're like, okay, there's a group of does there, and you go out and you start looking everywhere else, right? You've picked up, maybe it's a small buck, whatever it is, you pick up that animal and then you go look somewhere else. Inevitably, we get curious and we go back and we glass up that animal again. It's always easier to find it if you know it's there. So that small buck or that group of does could have moved a couple 20 yards, 30 yards, and they're not really right there in sight anymore. But if you know they're there, you're going to pick that country apart. The same could be said for how many times is your hunting partner been like, hey, I got a buck, he's over on this hill, and you pick him up instantly. The mindset in your brain is like, there's an animal there, where did he go? It's like you lost it, but you're trying to find it again. I want you to take that principle and add it to all your glassing. I want you, when it cracks daylight, I want you to take a section of what you're glassing and say, where is that buck? I just lost him. Because when your brain is looking for nothing, it's going to find nothing. But when your brain's looking for a specific thing, it's going to find that thing. And I think there's so much truth to this, and it's really helped me, because you may not see the animal that's out in the wide open, but if there's something, just you can see a piece of it or partial, you just look a little bit harder, and you're kind of looking for that body type or figure. Instead of just looking in wide open spaces, you're now looking for animals that are partially hidden, because it's like, hey, I lost that. Where did it go? This has been huge, and it's something that I learned from the podcast I did with Greg years ago, and I still to this day use it all the time. I pretend that my buddy or my hunting partner found something, and he's like, hey, there's a buck right there, and I got to find it. So that's another huge one for me. The next thing I want to add to this is building a routine. Building a system and sticking to the system. Now, this could be how you scan a canyon, and it could be you're switching from your binos to your spotting scope. For me, it's very important to be very consistent on how I glass. So creating that routine so there's no misgaps. Whether you do anything in life is like how well you can create a system around it and repeat that. So I took the same concept that when I go glassing, I'm like, okay, I get set up, I pan with my open eyes, and I'll scan all the open areas with my binos, and then I'll go back and I'll pick it apart section by section. Usually, I do it, basically segment the whole mountain into pieces. And then when I get done with that, I do another scan with just my eyeballs, right? So I've found that I can find a good portion, like 30 to 40% of my animals with eyeballs. So I don't actually want to get stuck into, say, my 15s and just be behind that, picking everything apart. And then I'll kind of just repeat this system. And I have a system of like, okay, now I'm going to jump in the spotter and I'm going to check these timber pockets. So when I was younger, I used to basically pick open spots. You always look at the open spots, and you're looking for that animal that's in the wide open, but rarely does that happen. So you have to develop a system, and I think how your system isn't as important, but I have a system for how my binos go on my tripod. I have a system for always using a tripod. I have a system for when I move from the binos to the spotting scope. I have a system for how my tripod lays out when I'm seated on the ground. All these things that are just very regimented, and I can repeat them every single time. And for me, that's like it creates a great system that I can continuously use. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to set up, and this is about how long it's going to take me, and I'm going to spend this much time. And in 2 hours, I'm going to switch. I'm going to move to another side, and then I'll come back here. So for me to combat that ADD, it works really well for me to have a great system that I know, like, hey, here's how I do it. Here's how it's done. And I don't necessarily think that it matters what your system is as long as you create a system. Lastly, on tactics. You've probably heard this before, but it's so absolutely true. It's get comfortable. Get comfortable, get comfortable. And this boils into my system too, like the way I have everything set up and the way I always set my tripod up so it's perfectly level. I don't half-ass it. And this is one of the things that drives me nuts is like when people half-ass their tripod setup and they're kind of like over here. Like, nope, I spend the time, the extra couple minutes, or minute maybe 2 minutes, to get comfortable, make sure my tripod is set up perfectly. I have a certain height that then I raise the top piece. My tripod's getting used for a camera right now, so we can't really show, but I use that top piece to extend. That way I know when I switch from my binoculars to my spotter, I can lower it, and that lowest level is going to be where my spotter needs to be because I'm not messing with things. So I can go back and forth constantly. And so getting comfortable for me is about setting it up right to ensure that you're going to last longer. You're going to spend more time glassing, because if we know that all the greatest hunters spend a lot of time glassing, and that's consistently throughout, I don't know, hundreds of podcasts, is like that's the key takeaway, then we know we need to get comfortable. Another piece of getting comfortable is like packing a chair. Like, as silly as that sounds, like you can spend a lot more hours sitting in your little packable chair and getting comfortable and spending time behind the glass. For me, another reason I will pack a chair or a pad is because I know I'm going to stay there longer and not have that need to want to push or want to move or go to the next place. For me, it's like, get comfortable because this is what we're doing. And it's setting up your tripod right. It's getting your pad right. Whether you got to move some rocks, you're not sitting on one. Like, just get comfortable. That way you're willing to put in the hours behind the glass. You're willing to sit there. And I think there's something to be said for setting up a chair, because then you aren't going to want to move. You're like, oh, you just got everything set up. I got this perfect system. So for me, it's about creating a system, getting comfortable, and letting the glass do its work. Having good glass is huge. And we can kind of run through my system as far as glass goes. For me, I've talked about this at length on Maven's blog as well, but a lot of hunts, it'll just depend which glass I use. I'm really big on the 15s and the 18s right now. On a tripod, I think those are just bomber glass, and I know I'm going to spend more time looking through 15s or 18s than I will using a spotter. For me, I use a spotter. It allows me the ability to look a lot farther, but at the end of the day, I'm going to spend more time glassing if I'm using just a binocular type setup. So I love 15s, I love 18s, and I use a spotter to kind of confirm or watch something. I still always have it, but for me, I spend a lot more time looking if I'm using binos. So which ones you use, it's kind of on you. I am leaning more towards like just running the 15s this year. I think 10s, 11s, I run the 11s a lot. 11 by 45 Maven makes. It's a B1. It's a great or B2, great binocular. But and I'll use those constantly. I don't think it really matters. I do think putting your glass, binos, anything on a tripod is huge. I think that's another big piece of it. I will carry a tripod whether I have a spotter or not. Tripod is a must for me, and I pretty much always have it. That's a huge reason I can switch to the 15s, is because my glassing system has pretty much move towards, if I'm not glassing off a tripod, I'm not doing anything. I might as well set up a tripod. So I always have a tripod. That's a huge piece of it. And that's the reason I can go to a 15. Another tip you can do actually, so 15s, whether you have say you don't have a tripod or not, say you're running a bigger bino. And I do this even with my 11s is with my bow, I can set my bow on my foot and put my basically binos on top, which will steady it up quite a bit. Having steady glass is kind of the end all be all for me. And it's about being able to see movement, or micro pieces of an animal, whatever it may be. So a lot of times when I'm using my binos or binos or a tripod or a spotting scope, either one, like I want to be able to stop and see movement very well. And that's a huge piece of, say, having your tripod. But there are tips you can do for holding those steady. Also, one of the tips is like, as you hold your binos, you can hold your hat, which is going to make it a little more steady. But by and large, I say use a tripod all the time. That's a huge piece of it for me. One more tip that I want to add on top of a tripod. This is a personal thing for me, but I love having a fluid head. To me, I would rather pack the extra weight and have a fluid head over a ball head. I know some guys like ball heads, but for me, it's about getting that fluid head solid and level so I can pan completely, and I am constantly able to just basically stop everything, and that fluid head is going to be right where it is, because it's, if you use a good solid fluid head, it should sit right there, and I just run it tight enough that it'll stay. So as I'm panning, I can stop, let go of everything, and be dead still, and I can check things. So this, even when you start looking really, really far away, even with 15s, 18s, as you pan, you can stop everything and basically look at a finite thing. You'd be amazed at how much just the subtle movement of your hands on the glass, even on a tripod, makes a difference when you're looking at, say, at 1,500 yards or 2,000 yards. Being able to just stop, let everything kind of settle, focus, and be able to pick the smallest detail apart has been huge. So huge fan of fluid heads. Tripod, I tend to run a medium tripod, and we can get into this. I have backpacking tripods. I use a Bonero. It's a pretty small, light one. I would say most of the time, if I'm not going really deep and weight's a huge issue, I'm going to run the Sirui, don't know how you say that, with the VA5 fluid head. I would say a medium weight tripod, but I've learned that I like the medium weight tripod because I want a little bit of stout. Another pro tip I guess you could dive into is having a stand-up tripod. This is something you pick up from the guys that'll hunt down in Arizona, where you pretty much have to be standing to see anything. And I use this constantly. I like having a stand-up tripod that's set up in my pickup. Another pro tip is be a road hunter. And this is the craziest thing to me. But I've learned from some really, really great hunters that you can glass from the road and see things that people drive by constantly. And I know more than a few of my guests have found giants that they spotted from the road. And you think, how can you spot from the road? We're talking like 2 miles away or more. And, I think you see a lot of this in the southern or more open areas, but being able to stand up, maybe put that tripod in the back of your truck, but having a setup. I like to have 18s that'll go on my stand-up tripod, and that's kind of my truck setup. So if I'm cruising around, scouting areas, whatever it may be, I can pop up instantly and glass stuff that's up to 2 miles away, and kind of be able to tell if there's an animal in a certain area. You'd be so amazed at how many people drive by giants or animals that people didn't even know were there. They get in this mindset. Everyone has this mindset of getting into an area and then starting to hunt. And you'd be amazed how much you can turn up just by looking at stuff from miles away. And this happened to me on a particular case where I was glassing a mountain and heard an elk that I didn't think was there. Very micro mountain that I would not have guessed. And was able to get a lot closer and get in on those animals. But having multiple setups, right? So I have a backpack setup. I have my probably general setup, which I would say is like a medium weight tripod with a fluid head, and my backpack setup's, the smallest, lightest tripod I can get, but with a ball head. And then I have a very heavy duty stand up that I can actually go full stand up, have 18s on, they click in, so I'm not worried about them falling off. But like with the VA5 head, I can basically set my 15s on top of them and they'll just rest there. I don't need to click them in. I'm just comfortable with them that way. And that way I can pop them off and slide in, say, my spotter if I need to quickly. But having multiple setups is huge. And, this could mean maybe I hike just a little ways from the pickup, up on a knob that you can get to, and use my big setup. Now I can stand up, be comfortable, and those things. So I like having multiple tripod setups, multiple optic setups, depending on what I'm doing. Alrighty, so as we wrap this up, there's a bunch of tips there. I want to talk about big picture. And one of the biggest things for me is you need to, as you develop your skill as a glasser, right? Think of it as a skill that you're going to develop and become better at. You start to design your hunt around that skill set. As I wanted to become a better at glassing, I started hunting areas that would cater to that particular skill set. And I think there has a lot of unique advantages. I did the same thing when I had the ability to call, right? And I would choose dark timber because I knew I could hunt that dark timber. And I still think that's a huge skill set that I am really proud to own. And I have no qualms about going into dark timber and chasing a bull up close with a bugle. But I also want to be able to use my glassing and be able to glass unique terrain. So it becomes, as you develop the skill, try to design your hunts around that skill set. And how can you do it better than everyone else? And that's kind of, as much as we're hunting against animals, I feel like if you think about it in the capacity of you're hunting against other hunters as well, you'll be much more successful. So design your hunt around what your skill set is, around what your optics can give you. And that is a huge, huge tool. And I think at the end of the day, it's important to think of optics as a tool and not the end all be all. Everyone else can buy really fancy optics too. So it becomes like how we design a specific skill set within that. So being able to design your skill set and your system and say, okay, how can I implement this? How can I choose areas around where I'm going to hunt to better suit that aren't going to be, choosing what everyone else is going to choose, say, hunting wide open plains because, everyone else has the same optic. So it's about designing that skill set. Being a great hunter is being able to have multiple tools in your tool chest, whether that's glassing, whether that's calling, whether it's able to out hike everybody else in the mountains. Those are all just different skill sets. And I think it's important to have those and refine each one. Hope this helps you guys become better glassers. And remember, just think of it as a habit, not a trait.